Okay, and PowerPoint. Oh, share first. You gotta get the sequence right too. Share that one. Okay. And then get the PowerPoint going. And we'll make sure that we have it. Okay, I need someone in the audience here to confirm that they got it. If you are not muted after that, please do mute yourselves. Although I'm going to try and get you all muted
Yeah,
anyway.
it's on.
Can you see it, Mary?
Looks good, yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I'm going to mute everybody. Except me, which will be what Daniel and Dawn will be using. And I'll get rid of that little thing so that they can see their presentation. And now, Dawn, if you wouldn't mind coming up, you're welcome to say a few more words of introduction about your background and how you came to do this. Okay. So speak right in, and your keys are over here. And I can hide this thing. Okay.
So, hello, everyone.
That way.
Pointing this way?
Yeah.
Okay, raise your hand in the back if I start to stray like that, and but I'll try to keep reminding. You may have to remind me as well. So, I'm Don Kramer, retired McGill professor who's been in the Victoria area for about 15 years, and I did study animal behavior as a professor, and I can't actually remember how the particular project on the vultures got started. I think probably Daniel and I started talking. Anne may have played a role in that. And eventually we agreed that there was a potential paper from Rocky Point in the data that they had for so many years about the number of turkey vultures that were seen at Rocky Point. And so we started collaborating, and it was a bit slow at first and got going. And very fortunately, I had a former student, Steffi Lazert, who's now a statistical consultant, and she was able to and willing to help us greatly. Without her, we couldn't have done it at all. So we kind of divided up the task, with Steffi working on the statistics, Daniel being the Rocky Point liaison and the data guy because he knew that better, and I did the background research and did the first draft of putting the paper together. So it was very much a collaboration, and of course, as Daniel will talk about with that, with many other people who have helped along the way. And so because I did the background work, the way we've divided this talk is for me to do a bit more research and try to find out things about spring migration as well as fall migration, and present an overview of what's happening with climate change and bird migration. So that'll be the first half of the talk. And then in the second half of the talk, Daniel will come on and talk about our project, which we believe is very close to final approval for publication. Okay, now supposedly this is going to. Okay, and the question is, and what's this was the key that you pointed out, that it's not advancing, that key.
Okay, sometimes the first one you have to. Okay. Yeah, so it'll work from there.
Okay, so as I've said, this is a two-part presentation, and I've given the overview of what I'm going to do. And if you have questions of interest or to follow up, we'd appreciate it if you save those to the end because of the timing of the talk. But if you can't hear, say something or wave, or if I completely stop making sense, please let me know. Okay, so this is part one. How is, I do believe the volume has been turned up. If it's too loud, you'll have to wave it in. this is how climate change it seems to be affecting bird migration, especially with a focus on North America. And so I think all of us are very much aware that the climate is warming and becoming more variable. This is a long data series from Environment Canada about how the average temperature in Canada is changing from the average over way back to the 1960s. But with a warming climate, then spring is coming earlier, fall is coming later, and there's the possibility of the environment changing for the birds. But there's a lot of variation among years, and that makes a difference. And it's not only a difference among years, but as these graphs show, there's a huge variation regionally in how much the climate is changing. And we all know, because we've experienced it ourselves, there are large changes in precipitation, in the wind, and in the variability of the weather. And those things are also very regionally affected. So there's a lot going on. Now, there's many ways that climate change could affect the ecology of migratory birds. The breeding areas might be suitable for longer periods of time with climate change. However, the time that the food is most abundant, especially for feeding the young, may be changing earlier you'd expect if the climate is warming, and also the conditions for migration with changes in the wind, changes in the temperature, changes in the cloud cover, and so on, could have many effects. And of course, that's not all. I think many of you could think of other ways that migration might be affected by a changing climate, but those are some of the major ones. And so if we think about how could birds deal with the changing climate, one of the possibilities is that they could migrate earlier in the spring or later in the fall to have the conditions more or less constant. But do they do that, and how do they do that? So what I'm going to try to cover here is a broader overview about, is the timing of migration actually changing with the climate, or are the birds staying as they were? And are these changes enough to keep up with how the climate is changing? So I'll start with some data examples to give you an idea of what's going on. We'll focus first on spring migration. So this is a study that was done at Delta Marsh in Manitoba. This is a field station that's been going for a very long period of time. So they had data from 1939 up to 2001 for this study. So that's over 63 years. And they had a standard protocol where people went out in the spring every day to see what birds were present. And so they could record the time of the first arrival. And so if you look at the upper left figure, you see for the Canada goose, well, actually, let me explain the axes a little bit more. So most of these studies, the arrival time is put on day of the year. So you start with January 1st is day one, and then you just go on. So if that's a little bit confusing and you're thinking in months, just think that, months have about 30 days. So you can think of day 90 as the 1st of April and day 120 as the 1st of May. So you probably can't read those numbers on there anyway, but if you were curious about it. And on most of these graphs, the x-axis will be the years. And I've usually tried to remember to put the years of the study up at the top. So the Canada goose was dropping, which means that the day that they arrive is becoming lower and lower. And so this downward slope means earlier arrival. And when you measure the average, what you get is about 2.8 days per decade. So every 10 years, they're coming on average 2.8, so almost 3 days earlier. Now, 3 days doesn't sound like a lot, but over, in this case, 6 decades, and over a longer period of time, it actually really adds up and could make a big difference in how well the geese are adjusting to the changing time of spring in the north. And so grackles were coming at a similar rate. They come later in the spring, but they were showing a similar rate. And I want to point out to you that there's a huge amount of variation around that line. So the line shows an average change, but you can look, and even in the same couple of years, there's a large variation above and below. And so one of the questions is, how well does that correspond to the changes in the climate that are changing a lot from year to year? But not all the birds are coming earlier. The lesser yellowlegs is actually coming later, so the line is sloping up. So they're coming later, and the change over that period of time is even greater than the geese. So it's over 3 days per decade. And the sharp-shinned hawk, there's variation around the line, and there's a very slight trend, which would not be significant at all. So the sharp-shinned hawk is basically coming on average at the same time over that 60-year period. So you can see there's a lot of variation. Now, if we look at all the data, they actually had they had enough data for to study 96 species. And in this graph, what you have is the number of species that were coming earlier versus later. So the blue part of the bar is those that were statistically significant. And so there was something in the mid-20s of species that were coming significantly earlier, and a whole lot more. So a total number of in the mid-70s had a trend, even though it wasn't statistically significant. On the other hand, species of coming later, only 2 were significant. And strangely enough, and the paper didn't comment on that, but that was the 2 yellow-leg species, greater and lesser, that were actually coming significantly later over time. And some of the other species were showing a trend in that direction as well. Now, first arrivals are interesting, and it's great that not only Delta Marsh biologists, but also just amateur naturalists are interested in, when does the first robin in spring, that doesn't apply to us, but in the East, when does the first robin in spring arrive? And when does each bird arrive? So, all the way back to Thoreau and earlier, naturalists have been recording when the first bird arrives in the spring. But, I mean, those of you who are keen on your eBird records know there's sometimes an odd bird that's around early, and the amount of effort that you put into searching will probably make it come earlier and earlier, because you'll be more likely to find that rare one. And if the population is bigger, you're more likely to see it. So first arrival isn't a very good, isn't the best data, but it does have the value of a long period of time. So here's a different study that used used data from banding stations across North America. This is a much more, the banding stations record all the birds that they capture as they come through the station. So instead of looking at the first arrival, or the first capture, what you can look at is the day that the average bird came, or in this case, what they used was the day that the first quarter of all the birds that they caught that season arrived. And so these are quite different from the mixed group at Delta Marsh. For one thing, it was all across North America, many, many banding stations. And it's also, they looked at passerines specifically, and long distance ones that wintered in the neotropics. And so in this case, however, we see a similar change. Most of the species, as you can see in the left bar, most of the species are coming earlier or show a trend that way. A few are significantly later, and a few others show a trend. And there's a few that show no change at all. The average, like that sharp-shinned hawk in Manitoba, it's so little change you can't even see a trend in it. Now, I apologize for this graph. This was a wonderful study with a terrible graph, which I had to split in two to show it at all. But the topic is really important. So don't worry too much about trying to see all the data. I think birders would have more fun just looking at the pictures on the left to represent the different families that they studied. But basically, a number of researchers talk about birds migrating northward as surfing the green wave. In other words, as spring comes, from south to north in North America, the vegetation greens up and the birds will follow. And of course, many of them are not eating the vegetation. What they're eating is, or feeding to their young, is the caterpillars that are coming out on that new flush of vegetation. So in this study, they used satellites to detect how the environment was greening up and to get that time. And thanks to all the people who use eBird, they used eBird data to get across North America and timing to look at when people were reporting the birds. And I think they took the midpoint of the arrival as well as the midpoint of the time of greening up, and then looked for the correlation for those two. And so if the birds were perfectly matching the green up, you would get a correlation of 1.0. So if we look at the x-axis, you see it only goes up to about 0.4. So these are the correlation values. Don't worry about, I can answer questions about the orange and blue later, but it's not important for this. The most important point is that most of the data are shown at about the 0.1. So that's sort of like only about 10% of what's actually, they're only matching at 10% of it. So the green up is coming north faster than the birds are coming up. The few species down there that have higher correlations over to the right are ducks and geese. And so, as we saw in the Manitoba data, they do seem to be able to adjust earlier, and they're not coming from as far in many cases, but not in all. Now, this is the other half of that one for another bunch of species. And again, it's just really to show you that most of the trend is sort of less than 20%, less than 0.2. And so this is this and this next study I'll show you are just very recent studies that people have had the capacity. There's enough data, because of course eBird hasn't been going very long, enough data to pull it together and start to ask these questions and look at the really big picture. But there's a lot more work to do. If you look down at the little squares, you'll see most of these studies are in 2024, 2025. Now, this is a second one of the big studies that was done in a somewhat different way. First of all, they realized, as many of us have, but they realized it with data, that the birds could be adjusting to climate change by moving farther north to get to their preferred temperature. Where there's mountains, they could be moving higher in elevation to get to the preferred temperature, or they could be coming earlier. So this study asked how well the birds were correlating, and in this case, they used temperature rather than green up to ask how well they were correlating. So if you look at the lines, there's a very faint dashed horizontal line starting at 0, and that would be the value if they were making no change. And then there's a heavy black line that is slightly different from the dashed line. That's the average of all the species. And so you can see, if you look at the left-hand graph, the birds are moving slightly higher on average in latitude, slightly higher in elevation, and they're breeding slightly earlier. Now, this case was done not by directly migration, but an indirect effect of it is the MAPS project, which measures from banding stations when the juvenile birds first appear there. So it's not perfectly correlated with the migration time, so it's slightly out of the topic, but it was such a nice study that it was really important to show you. Now, the rate of movement might seem rather slight. The northward movement was only about an average of 1 kilometer per year on average, upward in a higher elevation, only about 1.2 meters per year, and in terms of days, about 0.08 days per year. So that's still under 1 day per decade. But what's really interesting here is how much variation there is. And this isn't just random variation from statistical sampling error. This is real variation in real birds that are coming. So you can see by those purple lines, many of them are going much farther up, sometimes up to 13 kilometers per year farther north, but there's still many going much Some are actually going south as well. So instead of following the temperature change north, they've actually gone south. And you get the same issue with the altitude and the same issue with the breeding time. On average, they're breeding earlier, but some are later and some are very much later and some are very much earlier. So a really important issue from the scientist's point of view and from the bird's point of view, of course, is what's causing all that variation? Why are the different species so different? And this is some more data from the same study. It's a way to look at how closely are they tracking the changes in temperature. So the graph on the left, the pie diagram, is the one that shows how much what percentage they were successful in tracking the rising temperature. And so the changes that they had on average in latitude and elevation were only a few percent, about 6%. And in breeding time, that was about 22%. But altogether, they're still only tracking about a third of the actual changes in the temperature. So they're missing a lot. And the graph on the right kind of emphasizes that individual variation much more. So the 0 line is not tracking at all, and the higher dashed line is 100% tracking. And what you can see from that graph is that some are actually over tracking they're going farther than the climate change. The majority are between the 0 and the 100 mark, but a lot of them aren't tracking completely, and some are going in the opposite direction. The different bars match the different measures, but I think we don't really have time to go into that. So there's a huge amount of variation, and this could be very important for the survival of these bird populations. Now, I've been talking about spring. What happens in the fall migration? One might expect birds to migrate later when the conditions remain suitable later into the fall. That why not stay up where you were breeding? On the other hand, if they arrive earlier and finish breeding earlier, that might be better for them to finish to just leave and go back to the non-breeding areas. Alternatively, multi-brooded species, that is, that can have more than one clutch in a year, might finish relatively early and be able to take advantage of the warmer climate and perhaps a decent food supply to breed again. And this might end up keeping them later. So that gives some hint as to what might be going on. But in the fall, what do the data look like? So here's another source of data, hawk watches. These occur, as you'll see when in Daniel's talk, in our specific case of turkey vultures, these occur when birds are funneled down into a place where to cross a mountain barrier or a body of water, they all gather in a certain place before crossing. And this gives a good chance to count them. And there are well-established hawk watches. In the old days, they used to be hunting sites that people would just shoot hawks for target practice. Oh, okay. Dana's saying, talk into the mic. Thanks. And so at one of these well-established hawk watches, starting as early as 1974, they gathered data on the number of birds the timing of the birds passing through. And what you can see is here, the turkey vultures were coming later, so now the line is sloping up. They're taking their time in the north and coming later. Northern harriers later, sharp-shinned later, American kestrels later, but bald eagles showing completely the opposite trend much earlier. So this graph, I think I probably should keep moving, but basically it's to get all the data from the hawk watch together. And what you can see is the vertical line is no change for each species. If they're to the left, they're going earlier. If they're to the right, they're going later. And the significant ones are black dots. And so 4 species are going later, but only in that area of about 1 day per decade. And the bald eagle is going substantially earlier, and many are just sitting on that line. Another study was done by citizen science in Quebec along the St. Lawrence River, where they were studying waterfowl, and they had people who were willing to collect data at a whole series of points along the St. Lawrence in Quebec on the arrival of waterfowl. And these data show patterns somewhat similar to what we saw in the Hawkwatch study. Again, you probably can't see all the details of the species, but I've put plus signs with green squares to indicate the ones that were showing a significant increase in the or later migration time. And you can see that the majority of species have been coming later. So this was from 1970 to 2012, but the common goldeneye was coming earlier and substantially earlier, and several species like blue-winged teal weren't showing any trends at all. This study was stopped because of the development of eBird that had everybody reporting on eBird instead of in this particular study, but it does indicate how citizen science can be very helpful in giving a big picture. Now, you've got the general sense that raptors and waterfowl might be tending to migrate later in the fall, but what about neotropical passerines? So in this is the same study as I showed earlier, but I only showed the spring data before. So I've repeated the spring data so you can see it. And this is and to the right-hand side is the fall data. And what you can see is that actually for the passerines, they're still coming earlier. The majority are significantly earlier or showing an earlier trend, but a substantial number are coming later, showing a bit of a trend, and a very large number are showing no change at all. So there's quite a difference between spring and fall, and there's also a difference between the passerines that are traveling a long distance and the waterfowl that in many cases are not, although some are. So the strange things that happen when you're preparing a talk like this that you've been preparing for some time. Today, in the Times Colonist, they had a bird migration joke. And it said, in my day, we migrated earlier using our instinct. And that's exactly, so gaggle maps is not something that they actually use, but the point is this: why would short distance migrates be changing more than long distance migrates? The reason is probably that they have more information on how the climate is changing in the area where they're going, and they're able to adjust how far south they go and how far north they go and respond to that temperature. Whereas something that's in the rainforest in Brazil or in northern Colombia doesn't have much information about how the season is developing in central British Columbia, for example, and maybe still relying on the instinctual information about what the day length should be when they actually start migrating. So besides the long distance and short distance migrants, there are some other patterns. There's much that we don't know, but some other patterns. In the spring, males are increasing their arrival dates faster than females are. Species with increasing populations are changing more than species with decreasing populations, and that could be actually the cause could be the other way around. It might be that species that aren't changing with the weather are also losing populations. And also, when people can compare how much of the change is occurring in different decades, the rates of change are increasing more recently. In the fall, there are also some patterns, and again, we see a long distance, short distance distinction, and also herbivores tend to delay more than other diet groups, and we've seen that with the ducks and the geese in particular. So and if we try to think about why is all this happening, it's important to remember the environmental cues that the birds could use for migrating are sometimes very distant from where they are. So if the breeding and wintering locations are far, it's hard to get that information or impossible. Long-term trends there's changes in temperature, wind, and food supply, but there's this huge amount of variation between years that could affect birds that have a relatively short lifespan. The flight speed could be affected by the wind and the temperature, and the barrier conditions may be changing. So one of the important things in Europe is for trans-Saharan migrants that have to migrate south in Europe, cross the Mediterranean, then cross the Sahara before they get their wintering grounds in Central or Southern Africa. also have problems if the Sahara gets much too hot and the food supply gets too low when they're actually having to cross it. That's a serious problem. So barrier conditions can be important. Stopover sites can change either due to natural changes from, we can't really call them climate change natural, but also the way industrial development, as we've seen with Roberts Bank and so on, are changing stopover sites. They can change. Breeding locations can be changing, and wintering locations can be changing, and all of these could be having potential effects and make make following the data, following the patterns difficult. So birds have a series of sources of information. They have inherited timing information. There's been quite a bit of work on the genetics of that, so there is variation. They could eventually evolve to change, but the evolution would be much slower than the climate change. They can use the current conditions and hope that that predicts someplace else. And of course, I should mention, when you're actually trying to do research on this, it's really hard to judge what temperature, what area you should be measuring the temperature to see if the birds are tracking it. Plus, birds can use their individual experience, and there are some studies that show that adults are changing more than the first year juveniles. And finally, there can be social cues that information from other individuals can provide can provide information, and they may follow others. But in many cases, the juveniles migrate separately from the adults, and so that information is not available. So the implications are for conservation that a mismatch between the migration time and the peak food supply puts populations at greater risk. And there are some specific studies on this that look at the timing of arrival and when, say, the old caterpillars matured, and find that the birds are becoming farther away from the ideal time when they're trying to feed their young. There's also a practical side in waterfowl management. If the ducks are migrating much later, the hunting season may have to change, or there'll be economic consequences from that. Or if you adjust the hunting season to protect particular species, you have to know how they're changing. So there's a great deal still to learn, and it's time to turn the mic over to Daniel, so I can wave if he's not pointing at his face, and he can talk about our efforts to do one particular study that gives some insights into some of these questions.
Are you ready? Okay, your arrow keys should work now. You should be good to go.
Hello, hello. Can you guys hear me? Awesome. Thank you. My name is Daniel. Thank you for setting up the stage, Dawn, and thank you, Anne, for inviting us to present some of the exciting results on turkey vultures and migration in general. So I'm Daniel, and I'm with Rocky Point Bird Observatory for the last, 13 or so years, involved in many different roles on the board and the science committee, but most happily involved as a volunteer at the field station, actually gathering the data. And so Rocky Point, our mission is bird conservation through monitoring, research, and public education. We've recently had our 30-year anniversary, so we've been around for a while, and we are a member in a much bigger organization in the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network, which is a collaborative effort of many bird observatories across Canada. And our main purpose is to gather high quality data on the migration, most particularly of boreal breeders. Now, why boreal breeders? because those boreal breeders are not really covered in more traditional surveys like the Breeding Bird Survey or Christmas bird counts. There's just no roads up there for surveyors to do breeding bird surveys, right? So we catch these birds on their southbound migration. Now take a look at the location of Rocky Point. We're the only member station on the west coast, and that gives us a special role and almost like a special obligation, because we're the only station that really contributes significant data for species in the far west, such as olive-sided flycatchers, band-tailed pigeons, and one of few stations that contributes meaningful data for species like boxer swifts or violet green swallows or even McLivery's warblers. Now let's have a little closer look at our location, because this will become important for the turkey vultures. So Rocky Point is located on a peninsula on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. Like we're literally at the southern tip of Vancouver Island. We have another field station at Pedder Bay, but all the data for the turkey vulture paper came from Rocky Point. So I'm going to focus on the Rocky Point site today. And so let's zoom out a little bit. Right, so here's Rocky Point on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And so you see that the birds that are funneling into this area can't go any further south without facing this water barrier, right? The Strait of Juan de Fuca. And so that is a solid barrier, right? About a 20-kilometer stretch of water that you have to cross. And zooming out even further, you can really see what a large area this funnels into, right? The birds are coming down the coast on both sides of Vancouver Island. Maybe some birds are coming from the Sunshine Coast, and they all find themselves sort of gathering around the southern tip of Vancouver Island, waiting for a good day to do that major crossing. And so I should mention that this is a phenomenon that occurs in fall migration. We don't see a similar trend of accumulating birds in spring migration, right? They disperse northbound without funneling through Rocky Point. But in the fall, we really have a high concentration of passerine, so a perfect spot for a bird observatory. Now,
can I just interrupt? The camera needs to be adjusted on Daniel. We're just seeing your torso, not your head.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, that was a voice like out of George Orwell. Where's the camera? Okay, is that better?
I can make it so we can see.
Okay, let's have a look here. Sorry about that. Thanks for the feedback. So this, by the way, is a view from Edie Point in our Rocky Point census area. Is that better? Yes. Okay. You know what, and you can leave that on, then I can see my picture. Yes, okay. I didn't have any kind of feedback about where I was.
Except it's on our screen as well. So.
Okay, thank you. So this is sunrise at Edie Point. And so if you're a white-crowned sparrow and you want to go to Puget Sound, you got to hit that way, straight across, right? And so this is on a nice day, but often it's foggy, it's cold, it's damp, and there's a gale blowing. So this is a formidable barrier for a small passerine, even for a large bird, right? And so many birds end up staying around at Rocky Point to refuel, to gather food and strength, or just to wait out some bad weather and migrate on that perfect day where they can make that crossing. And so what do we do at Rocky Point? Let me just give you a 2-minute overview. We have 6 core programs, and then we have a couple of special programs, but our bread and butter is basically hummingbirds. Dawn already mentioned monitoring aviation productivity and survivorship. We have a MAPS project. We monitor northern sorbet owls. Remember, one of our mandate is public education. So we got education programs year round. We run Sea-Watch, and we run passerine migration, right? This is the longest standing project that Rocky Point has. And all the data for the turkey vulture paper came from fall migration. So let's talk a little bit more about fall migration. So migration monitoring consists actually of 3 important parts. We band birds, we do census, and we do general observations. And so this picture here is actually a shot of net 1 and net 2 at Rocky Point. You can see the net poles, the nets are furled, they're not open right now. And you see the front meadow. There's a pond on the left. There's a riparian area ahead. There is a coastal mudflat behind me. There's some Gary Oak meadows. It's a very diverse habitat. And so this is the front meadow. And I want to point out the really nice unobstructed view that you have from that front meadow of the sky and birds that might be migrating or staging in that sky during migration. And so a dedicated crowd of highly trained professionals and volunteers during migration come out to Rocky Point each morning at the crack of dawn, actually before the crack of dawn when it's still dark, and they set up these mist nets. So they can open half an hour before sunrise. They're then open for 6 hours. They're checked every 20 minutes, and the birds that are captured are taken to the banding station. They're ringed, they're measured, and then they're released. Right? So that's how we catch that high quality data for the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. Then we do census. So an hour after sunrise, a skilled observer walks around the census route. And so you can see the census route. You can see the location of some of our nets here. Takes us to the entire census area just about and covers a wide variety of habitats. And during the census, which lasts for 90 minutes, the census person records all birds seen or heard. And then the last part of migration is observations, general observations. So these are really, really important because guess what? The swain's thrushes might be very loud and conspicuous before census start, but then they go quiet, right? And so the census person might miss many of them, right? Or after census, we might see large flocks of turkey vultures or bent-tailed pigeons. And so all personnel on site is trained to record birds throughout the 6-hour shift. At the end of the day, the team meets and determines what we call the daily estimated total. And so the daily estimated total is a sum of the birds that we banded, captured, birds that were seen or heard on census, and the birds that were seen doing general observations. Every effort is made to avoid double counting, right? So we actually reach a consensus for each species for each day. And so why write a paper on turkey vultures? Here you see a wonderful young turkey vulture just chilling on census there last week. And so, well, remember, one of our mandates is actually research, right? Research. And so even though we do hand the data over to the Migration Monitoring Network and they do trend analysis, it is always prudent and good to do more and look closer at the data. And so we had such a long-standing data set, and we sure see a lot of turkey vultures, right, that I thought we should do something about this. Here is a kettle of turkey vultures over Rocky Point. And so let me tell you a little bit about why we see so many turkey vultures over Rocky Point. So turkey vultures are what we call obligate soaring birds. So they're not very strong flappers, right? They can't just cross the Strait of Juan de Fuca like a peregrine falcon or an eagle or an osprey on the wing and just wing it. These guys rely on help from thermals to gain elevation, and they need to glide across, right? So they do this by soaring. And so turkey vultures need nice warm days without much cloud cover. The land needs to warm up, and the warming land will warm the air, and the air will start rising. And like an elevator, will take these turkey vultures up. And so this is called kettling. You might have heard that term, right? When many, many turkey vultures sort of spiral up and ride these thermals and gain elevation. And so for our daily estimated totals of turkey vultures, we don't catch any one of them in the nets. And have we ever caught a turkey vulture in the net?
No.
Never. Thank goodness. Good one. Yes, they're a little bit stinky on their feet, especially. And so we don't catch them in our nets. We barely, well, I shouldn't say we barely, but we only see relatively small numbers of them on census because, of course, censuses are now after sunrise, when the sun is not really up and the thermals aren't going yet. But we start seeing them later in the day. Near the end of the banding shifts, large numbers of them are soaring conspicuously over the station. So we're very confident that we don't miss turkey vultures because they're very visible over Rocky Point. And then something happened in 2022. Can you see those dots? Those are all turkey vultures. Maybe there's a few red-tailed hawks in there, but trust me, these are mostly turkey vultures. In 2022, all bets were off. It was a year of records. Remember, it was the most severe drought that Victoria had experienced, 90 days without significant rain. It was the day where many temperature records were shattered all across BC for the hottest days in in October. So it stayed hot for very long. It was dry, and the turkey vultures seem to have loved that. Now, can you help me out here? How many turkey vultures do you think do we have in this frame, by the way? 32. I think this is a very conservative estimate. 500, not bad. There's over 1,000, that's close. So there's actually 935 turkey vultures in this frame. I counted them. And but the thing is, this is only what my camera could catch, right? So there are some vultures left out on the left. There was an entirely different kettle far to the right that didn't make it into the picture. So 2022, I think I really got excited about turkey vultures, and I said, we got to do something about this. We got to look at the data. Is this just the new normal, or is this a 1 year off? And so I asked Anne, and can you get me all the turkey vulture DATs from all the years since the beginning in one file, please? and so Anne amazingly did this. And so she sent me a big file. Yes, a big file. And this is just a little snippet of it which I was able to organize sort of in numbers of turkey vultures on the left and then the running year across. And so I had all the turkey vulture data in front of me, and the first thing I did is I plotted them.
Yeah.
I made a graph where I plot the daily estimated total on the y-axis.
Another 3/4 of an hour or so.
And so the turkey vulture numbers as a function of the time of year. So we have the entire migration season in this graph, right? From July 23rd, all the way to October 18th when we stop. And so you see that we don't have a lot of turkey vultures at Rocky Point until about the beginning of September. Then things are really heating up. And around the end of September, we have a peak, and then things fizzle out. And so by the time we close on October 18th, we don't see a lot of turkey vultures anymore. And so when I saw this graph, I was really, really happy because I figured we really do capture the migration period for turkey vultures pretty well with our migration monitoring season at Rocky Point. We're truncating it slightly at the end, but not by much. Then I asked my daughter, who's much more skilled than I am at graphing things, to plot this in 3 dimensions for me. And so this is a graph she made for me where we look at the turkey vulture DETs on the vertical axis, again across the entire migration season on the x-axis, right? So from July 23rd till October 18th, but across each year. And so now we see a lot more detail here. And so if you look at this graph, and you can look at it from different angles, but does that look to you like it's slightly skewed to the right? And it looks like vultures are migrating later into the year, into the season, as time goes on. And the other thing you can sort of just eyeball from the graph is that it sure looks like that there's more turkey vultures in later years than in earlier years, right? And so I was hopeful that we maybe had something here for our paper. But I also realized there's no way I was going to do this alone, right? It did not have the capability or the capacities to take something on alone. And so I was looking for collaborators. And so really, really lucky for me, Don Kramer had, as he mentioned, moved to Victoria, retired here, but was still active. And he joined the birding community. He was an avid birder, and he was interested in the doings of Rocky Point Bird Observatory to a point where he even joined the science committee for a while. So Don was keenly aware of me trying to do something with the turkey vulture data set. And so I asked him, and he said, yeah, I can do something about this, I think. And even more lucky for me, he knew of a capable statistician who could actually pull it off and do the analysis. And so Steffi, I'm really glad to see you on the Zoom here today. And thank you for sending us a picture, right? Because everybody can see me and Don, but this is Steffi, our statistician, who worked really hard on this paper too. When she's not on the computer doing one of the things she likes doing, exploring the outdoors in Manitoba. And so I couldn't help it. Steffi was smiling on this picture, even though she was about to go on to a 2-kilometer portage. And so I asked her, hey, Steffi, were you still smiling at the end of this portage? And she said, well, I was still pretty, smiling. But my husband, he carried the canoe, so he was a little exhausted, but all fun and games, right? So the three of us set out to make a plan. So Don agreed to start with a thorough literature review, what had been done with turkey vultures, not just in Western North America, but generally in North America, and try to comb the literature for methods suitable to analyze such a complex data set. And he also agreed, and this is of course huge, to draft the manuscript, right? He was, of all of us, most experienced with writing scientific publications in the biological sciences, so he agreed to draft the manuscript. Daniel agreed to curate the data. There's always issues with such a large data set. You have to check it and cross-reference it and correct for effort. I won't go into too many details, but it's a job. And Steffi agreed to do the analysis with the models that Don would identify and that we agreed on. And then we also agreed to collaborate to finish the publication, to finalize the manuscript. And so we had two burning questions. We wanted to know, has the timing of migration changed over time over the last 25 years for turkey vultures over Rocky Point? And we wanted to know if there were more turkey vultures over Rocky Point than in the last decades. Have the numbers increased? And so Daniel went to work cleaning the data. And this is a very small portion of a very large Excel spreadsheet that had to be carefully cleaned. And so we're on a military base. And so occasionally the Department of National Defense, they go live, they do exercises, and they don't want to sit there when they do that, right? So we're not allowed. And so this results in some substantial gaps, data gaps. In gray, you also see some fields in green where it was raining, right? And so we don't ban passerines in the pouring rain. So there are serious gaps in the data, and so they had to be all ironed out. Don, meanwhile, went to work combing the literature for methods for migration timing. And so let me talk a little bit about migration timing. Don already mentioned it in his talk, but there are several methods to go about this. And the first one you've already heard, that uses basically the first and the last day of arrival of a species and the median. And so here's a hypothetical graph of some migrants that are observed at a station over 23 days. And the station was operational every day, right? So you get good data, so you're confident that you saw the first bird, you saw the last bird, and of course you were there every day, so you did not miss the peak, right? And so for a data set like this, first day of arrival, last day of arrival, and the median are meaningful migration metrics. Now, our data set does not look like that. We have holes, right? And our data set is slightly truncated at the end. And so we need a different method. And so what people do is they find functions. They find mathematical functions to model the data. And so now you can predict what kind of birds might have been there on the days that you've missed. And this is what we did, right? Our data set had lots of holes and we were truncated a little bit. And so this is the most technical slide I'm going to show in my presentation. This is what we did. Here's 1 year of actual Rocky Point turkey vulture data, 2020 every dot is a day, right? This goes from July 23rd to October 18th. And so you see that during the beginning of the season, there's very few turkey vultures over Rocky Point. And then at the beginning of September, things start to heat up. And then there's a peak around the end of the month, and then things slowly fizzle out. And so we used a mathematical function. We used general additive models to simulate the data. And then we used the function to calculate the following migration metrics. We calculated the start of migration. So that's that little bar here. The start of migration, okay? The day on which 5% of turkey vultures had passed. We calculated the last day of migration. The day on which 95% of the turkey vultures had passed. We also calculated peak migration, so the day between 25 and 75% passage, and we calculated the maximum, the peak, the day at which 50% of the turkey vultures have migrated. Then we did this for every year, right? Sorry, Steffi did that for every year, right? So she found the function for every year and calculated those migration metrics for every year. And then we used linear models to look if those migration metrics had changed. And so we did this for all of those, but because I don't want to put you all to sleep, I'm just going to do this for the peak, right? And so the results here, this is the day of peak migration as modeled over the entire 25 years, right? And have a look at this. There is an enormous amount of variation in it, but there's a clear trend. Turkey vultures are migrating later by about 1.5 days per decade. And so 1.5 days per decade might not seem that significant, but it's really in agreement with some of the trends that Don had presented earlier for the changes in spring migration. And it certainly is well within raptor migration. So this is a highly significant trend, I should mention too. Even though there's that much variation, the trend is highly statistically significant. So fall migration is delayed. Now, we also wanted to look at the turkey vultures, the numbers themselves. Are they increasing over Rocky Point? And to answer that question, we modeled the maximum DET, right? The maximum daily estimated total each year for turkey vultures over the entire 25-year period. And again, there's quite a bit of variations, but the trend is very clear, right? The turkey vultures over Rocky Point are increasing by about 2.8-fold. So over the 26 period. So this is an increase of about 4.2% annually. Now, interestingly, remember I mentioned something about the local turkey vultures or resident turkey vultures. Their numbers were generally low before migration started. We tracked them too, and it turns out that the number of resident turkey vultures increased by about the same amount, 4% per year. In conclusion, we are seeing more turkey vultures over Rocky Point in fall migration, and they're staying longer. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first study that has used counts of birds at a migration barrier to determine metrics of migration timing and population sizes. Right, this is quite significant because this is quite contrary to traditional hawk watches, where the hawk really has to cross an imaginary line to be counted. Okay, this guy's gone. Okay, here's another turkey vulture migrating, right? And so hawk watchers never look at aggregations of bird, right? For them, the birds really have to cross a line. And so we found no evidence in the literature that somebody's looked at aggregations of birds at a migration barrier and tried to figure out migration timing from that. And so this is an interesting study because it shows that this is a possibility. Yes, we can actually do this. And so I'd like to conclude by thanking the countless volunteers that were out in the field calculating the data every day. So this research was possible. Thank you. We also really like to thank Anne Nightingale, not just because she's our station permit holder, right? But because she is involved in many, many aspects of Rocky Point, and she was so kind and provided the initial data set and She would stay up all sorts of hours of the night to scan all data logs from the vending station so I could decide that we were closed due to rain and not to military exercises, right? So there was really a lot of work behind the scenes going on. So thank you, Anne. We like to thank Jill Radcliffe and her grad student, Kara Harrington from the Raptors, for some really insightful discussions before this project really started. We like to thank quite a few reviewers of earlier drafts for their critique and their support. You've made this a better paper. We like to thank the Department of National Defense for allowing us on their site. And we acknowledge financial support for this project from a variety of sources. And last, I'd like to thank you guys for your attention. Thank you.
More than you thought you'd find out about these guys, right? So Dawn and Daniel will be happy to answer any questions. If you want to speak up, I will repeat the question and then pass the microphone to the appropriate scientist. Any questions? Any questions from the Zoom room? I'll get this turned off and see if there's any in the chat.
Can I ask a question out loud? It's Melissa.
Yes, yeah. Hi, Melissa.
That's it. This is fabulous. Well done. A lot of work went into that. But I always love to see, having been in Souk since on and off for 60 years and watching the growth of the turkey. It's always good to see the data confirm what your observational trend, what you see and believe over the years. So it's just great, because it really is, good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have a question for them?
Oh, my question is, where do they go, the turkey vultures? Like, where's their southern, like, I imagine because we have residence ones, I imagine we have ones like later in the thing, maybe are from less farther north and they go less south, or not as far south or something. Like how far on average are these migrations? Or are they coming from all over? Do we know that?
Thank you so much for your question. So there's actually some pretty brand new research being done by Kara and Jillian with the raptors that are tracking the turkey vultures, but it's a complicated question that depends on the population of turkey vultures. So our turkey vultures, the ones that we've actually tracked and other people have tracked, they go Mexico and south of Mexico, but not much further south. Right? But then, of course, turkey vultures further south might go way past Panama, right? So it really depends on the subpopulations. But our turkey vultures definitely make it down to Mexico and beyond.
Okay, I see this says 5 new here, so let's see what the 5 new are.
Panama.
Okay, no question there.
Can I ask a question?
Just going to say, in response to Melissa, as far as where do they come from, the turkey vultures have been expanding their range northward in the same period that we've been studying here. So whereas, for instance, you talked about resident turkey vultures, we don't really have resident turkey vultures, even though we're seeing a lot more in the winter now. They're kind of getting trapped here as they're coming south and the weather's changed and they can't get across, at least not straight across the strait. So more of them are spending the winter here. But some of them are figuring out that if they go back up north a little bit, they can island hop across the Gulf Islands. And that's work that Kara and Jill have found using tracking devices on them. Tom, you had a question? I lost Tom. Thomas. That's more thanks.
There's a question from the audience, maybe?
Okay, yes.
So, looking at the population of turkey vultures throughout, Western Canada, do you think that it's actually a population increase, or is it a change in the distribution of where they're migrating?
So the question is, we're seeing more turkey vultures here. Is it an actual increase in numbers for the population as a whole, or is it because of this changing range that we're seeing not just the fringes of the population, but more of the primary population?
So we don't really have the data to give a definitive answer. to that for sure, because we're just seeing it at one particular place. And we don't know if they're all coming from Vancouver Island or some are coming over from the mainland and down. There are some hints of that. We don't know if the numbers are all going across in the same place. And Anne mentioned about maybe some island hopping through the Gulf Islands. So that's a little bit uncertain. But the hawk watches in the eastern North America and in central North America have shown increases in the turkey vulture population over time. And so those are actual counts of the number that are passing a point. And so this change, the change that we've seen in the maximum size of these kettles is matching what people have seen at hawk watches, often with much smaller sample sizes. So it's likely that the whole population is increasing, and not just moving northward. Excuse me. But it could be that by moving north, there's a larger population. So the only places that seem to be showing decreases in turkey vultures are sometimes in the southwest, in areas that have had severe droughts. There may be less food for them there, but the general trend is increasing, and it's likely to be the case here. So the top of their distribution may be moving up, and but the bottom staying more or less where it is, except in cases of severe drought. But we don't have a definitive answer for that. It is an important question, though.
Yeah,
Can I ask a question?
sure, go ahead. I'll come back.
Is there any molting going between the northern and the southern migration, or vice versa? When do they molt?
I know you know the answer to this.
So where do they molt? I'm not 100% sure, Tom, but I definitely see some pretty ratty looking turkey vultures gathering over Rocky Point, mixed with some really fresh plumages. So I don't know if it's a subpopulation, if it's just juveniles versus, head shippers versus adults, or if it's a mix. We haven't studied the mold in that detail yet.
Okay, but I would think that if there's any historical sort of skins at all, feathers, to perhaps assist in interpretation, just, simple stable isotope signatures of the early feathers, with those now might give some inkling of whether there has been a dietary shift in the south or the north or something like that. That might give, say, some insight to the population changes.
Yeah, so thanks, Tom. That's an interesting point, and it does bring up an issue about what factors change which species are coming earlier and which later. So some families tend to molt after breeding, so on their summer grounds, and those may be coming later because of that, the timing of their molt. Whereas the species that molt either on migration or only after they get to the wintering ground are among the species that seem to be not changing much and hightailing it back. So from the point of view of which species are changing, the molt is an interesting one. And I, not having worked very much on birds before, I wasn't at all sensitive to that issues. But it does seem like for banding stations, the molt phase is very important. So there probably is information on turkey vultures that could be used to check them.
Okay, yeah.
What's really interesting too is that when they do molt, they all seem to be molting the same feathers at about the same time. The young don't molt their primaries and secondaries of flight feathers in the first year, but and they don't do a complete molt each year like songbirds do. So you will see different birds in different phases, but often the sixth primary seems to be the first to go in a lot of these birds. And so you look up and it'll look good, except one missing feather, just kind of in the midst of their primaries. And you'll notice that many of the vultures have that same primary missing. The question here.
It seems that years and years ago, Canada geese used to migrate south. But of recent years, it seems they don't migrate at all. Is there any correlation between what's happening with them, the turkey vultures, and climate change?
Okay, I can take this one. The geese that you see here that don't seem to migrate at all are what I like to refer to as GMO geese, genetically modified geese. Prior to 1970, the highest number of geese we had on a Christmas bird count in Victoria was 125. Something happened in the 70s, and that was the Fish and Wildlife Department of the provincial government worked with other agencies to establish kind of mongrelized geese, eastern geese with western geese that kind of lost their urge to migrate and planted them in a variety of areas for hunting. And a large number of them were put right here in Elk Lake. And they took. And once this had been attempted multiple times and it did not take, but in the 1970s, it finally took. And geese are very long-lived and very productive. They have large broods. They're very protective of those broods. The population just started to skyrocket. So the birds that you may hear this week for the first time this fall, the smaller cackling geese are native Canada geese types here, and they mostly will keep going south. A larger number of them are staying around now too than back then. But these bigger geese that you see with the pale breasts are the result of an introduction of geese produced specifically for hunting.
Does that happen right across Canada or just?
It seems to have happened right across the world, right? I think that these birds were introduced in a lot of places, including in Europe and other places abroad, and certainly throughout North America. And the ones that are considered kind of the pest geese largely originate from these introductions.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, so the data that you showed us was based on maximum counts, right? Maximum daily counts, or did you also analyze minimum, median, and find the same sorts of patterns?
Yes, so the question was the analysis based on maximum count? And so for the increase in turkey vultures, the population, we've used the maximum DET. But for the shifting in the timing of migration, we used the entire data set.
So just to add a point, it is important to know that by looking at the maximum count, we're only sort of seeing what the largest number is at any one time. But at that time, many turkey vultures would have migrated before that, and others will be coming later. So those maximum counts are some factor of the weather that we don't completely understand and would have to study. So if the conditions are good for migrating to the southern island, but they're not good for crossing the strait, then you're going to get a big number there trying to get high enough to go. But if the conditions are good for them to keep going, you'll get lower numbers, even though there are many there. So that could be the subject of another study, but it would have to be a detailed analysis of temperatures and wind speeds and so on, and see and checking to see which ones are crossing and which ones not. But it's quite complicated. If you've ever been in any of these hawk watch watching the vultures, they circle out over the strait and then change their mind and come back, and they do that again and again. And to know which ones are leaving, you really have to have the scope sort of well out there and see that they're continuing. So it wouldn't be an easy study, and it would take new data. So this maximum number is just an indication of, we know there's at least that many, and that number is increasing by time. But of course, the weather could be changing that number too.
Yeah, the number could be increasing because of they're kegging up. The actual total number of birds is not changing. It may be less, but because they're all kegging up, they're in a kettle,
Yeah.
but they're kegging
Yeah.
up. And you know what I mean? They're waiting to get across
Yeah.
because the weather's changing, so your maxims are going up.
Yeah, that is possible, but because the numbers are increasing, around over 4% a year, it's unlikely that it's just due to the change of the weather, but that's something that we have to take into account in the absolute counts for sure.
This is something that the study that Jill Radcliffe and Kara Hetherington will help discuss, because they are actually tagging birds with tags that are sending it satellite signals, and or GPS signals, I can't remember which it is, but maybe both. And so they can actually see how long the birds are hanging around. So, and where they're going while they're hanging around. So we're getting some really good, this is how we found out about the island hopping, is because tagged birds with monitors that were sending back signals showed us that some were going straight across the strait and some were hanging around and some were going over to Salt Spring and then the San Juans, and away we go.
So I talked about methods a number of times, and so this is really shows the interplay between these methods. The tagging gives detailed movements of individuals, but you can't say from that how the population is changing or where most of them are going, but it shows what's possible and what some of them are doing. But these large counts that can be done by, you know, even on eBird or by observers using a standard method, give the bigger picture, but you have to keep working to see how one reinforces or contradicts the other and see how they relate.
Yeah. And the question that nobody's asked, I'll answer anyway. The highest number we saw in one single view, 360 degrees at Rocky Point, was 2,375. You wonder how the 75 got in there, because you have to estimate, right? You have to sort of figure, okay, that's 100, okay, 100, 100, 100. So we got 2,300, and then another group of 75 came in. Another question here, yes. Yeah.
I have a question for John. You were talking about the timing of migration. And you said that birds are also moving further north and further in altitude. It's that they were moving down. So why are they doing that?
Question.
Yeah.
So he's asking why birds, in addition to coming earlier, would be moving to higher elevations and farther north. So suppose that, you know, the limit of tolerance of a bird or its ability to raise its young would be at sort of, I don't know, say 15 degrees C. And the birds are looking, or say that's the optimal temperature, just to make a highly simplified story. The birds are looking to establish a territory at 15 degrees C. While as the climate is changing, you can find 15 degrees farther north, and you can find 15 degrees by moving up slope, or you can find 15 degrees by coming earlier. Now, there's much oversimplification in that kind of answer, but it does give you an idea of what would be how the birds could adjust. If you think of, say, you know, it wouldn't apply to vultures, but the time that insects come out, as you go up the mountain, the insects are coming out later. As you go farther north, they're coming out later. And as you get there earlier, they're coming out later. So the food supply then matches on those three parameters. Is that an answer to what you were asking?
Yeah, I'm just curious whether it was, if the food supply was part of the reason, or so you're saying it's both food supply and the relationship to temperature.
Yes, food supply seems to be probably the most important one, but people haven't really, as far as I can tell, looked at much about the energetic costs of maintaining body temperature or of maintaining cooling if it's getting too warm, and changes in the vegetation. One of the interesting things someone just commented on is that, for example, many warblers and thrushes switch from insects to eating more fruit on after breeding, and with the earlier seasons, the fruit supply as they go south is often past it, and so they've been missing those opportunities. So there may be a switch between the ones that are still get insects and the ones that are dependent on fruit. So there's a lot of complications and a lot of issues and a lot more still to be examined.
Okay.
Susan, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm just curious. There's so many turkey vultures now. Where are they nesting? I've never seen a turkey vulture nest, and I've never seen a little baby turkey vulture. So I just wondered if they talk a lot about them migrating and handling, but
so the question was, where are they breeding and how cute are their babies? So the first part is They tend to nest at elevation, so they like hills. Observatory Hill is a place where I have actually seen a nest. So local hills, yes. They lay their eggs on the ground. They like caves, so where rocks have fallen and they can get into a little cave, or a fallen log where it's hollow and they can get inside that. That's where they tend to go. The babies, when they're born, are white balls of fluff, and they hiss like snakes. So if you are walking or hiking up a hill, like you very well might be, if you hear a hissing sound in sort of a rocky, craggy area, where a lot of the rocks have fallen down, you probably have stumbled across a turkey vulture nest, but you'll probably smell it before you see it, because they don't smell good, right?
So that's another one of the real advantages of this radio tracking. So Jill and Kara catch the turkey vultures by kind of walk-in traps. So they put dead chickens out in the field somewhere, and the vultures get caught by the walk-in traps, and then they do radio tracking, and they found many more nests than anyone had ever seen before, because the nests are so well hidden that they then can track them and say, oh, somewhere on that hill on a cliff there's a turkey vulture nest, and then they can sort of find the location and put a wildlife camera and so on in to get those. So but previously there had been very few found on southern Vancouver Island.
Are they ready to fly?
It takes quite a long time for them to get their feathers, so they're in the nest quite a while. And the first thing that you see out of that ball of fluff is a little black face, and then you start seeing black feathers coming out. So like when they're tiny chicks, they are fluffy, right? Like really fluffy, like a silky chicken. And then the more rigid feathers come out, and so they go through a variety of phases. But yeah, they are very hard to find, and usually very inconvenient to find, because they're in areas where there's been rock falls, and so most people avoid those areas.
So some of those babies are in that picture, say they're ready to fly.
Oh yeah, so by the time that they've got their first fall, they've all left the nest. You'll notice the young ones, because their heads are not red, their heads are black or just starting to turn red. But yes, that's a turkey vulture that's only a few months old. They grow fast. Okay, well, oh, sorry, one more question here.
Yeah, it's about the birds, the songbirds and so forth that migrate up from down in the tropics or nearby. And are there climatic signs down there that correspond to earlier arrival of spring up in Canada?
I think there aren't very direct signs. I mean, global warming is quite universal, so in those tropical areas, it's getting warmer too. But it's not very likely that a year that's very warm in Colombia, say, would also be very warm in northern BC, where the bird might be heading. So I don't think, I haven't, this isn't a literature I'm highly familiar with. I did a lot of reading and to prepare for the talk, and I didn't see anyone who was indicating that there are good correlations across the globe that they could use. But it could be that no one has thought to really look carefully at it, and there might be some information. Some of the big trends, like the El Nino, La Nina changes, are very widespread and might give them some information. But how well they could use that, I really don't know. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and this kind of links all together is with the changes in climate, changes in the food supply, changes in elevation as a result of that. Audubon has a really good interactive application on their website, where you can toggle the temperature, look at a species and see where its range would change, where it would shrink, where it would stay the same, where it would expand with a certain level of increase in temperature, based on all the information they know about what they need in terms of their habitat, be it plants or insects, or other conditions. So there's a lot of tools out there right now that can really help. So this has been a great talk and lots of really good questions. So thank you, Dawn and Daniel. And thank you all for coming. Victoria Natural History Society, you may have seen, is rebranded as Nature Victoria. So if you're looking at the calendar, go to naturevictoria.ca and look at the calendar there. And that will tell you about upcoming presentations, whether they will be an in-person Zoom hybrid or whether they'll just be on Zoom. Events coming up and all sorts of other good things. So check out naturevictoria.ca. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And same to you all in the Zoom room. Thanks so much for your participation today.
Somebody's reading scientific papers.